Think about the quietest kid in the room. Not shy, not withdrawn, just settled, still, watching everything with eyes that seem to understand more than they should. Maybe that was you. Maybe you recognize someone in that description right now. Because there's a specific kind of child who never really got to be one. They didn't throw fits in grocery stores. They didn't need to be told twice. They handled things quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And every adult around them said the same thing. They're so mature for their age. It sounded like a compliment. It felt like one too for a while. But psychology has something very specific to say about what was actually happening underneath that maturity. And it changes everything. In this video, we're going to look at what it actually means when a child matures too soon. Not the surface-level version, the deep one. We'll look at what happens inside the developing brain. Why those early adaptations follow people straight into adulthood. And why so many grown adults who were once praised for their emotional wisdom quietly struggle in ways they can't fully explain. If any part of this resonates with you, stay until the end. Because the last section is the most important one. Every childhood has a texture to it. For most kids, that texture is loud, messy, full of scraped knees, forgotten homework, and feelings worn right on the surface. But for some children, the texture is something else entirely. Measured, careful, controlled. These are the kids who learned very early that the world around them required something from them that most children are never asked to give. Stability, awareness, emotional labor. Maybe the household was unpredictable. Maybe a parent was struggling financially, emotionally, or both. Maybe there was grief or illness, or simply an absence, physical or emotional, that left a gap no child should ever have to fill. And so, the child filled it. Not because they were told to, not always, but because children are extraordinarily perceptive. They read rooms the way adults read headlines. And when a child senses that the adults around them are overwhelmed, something quiet shifts inside them. They stop asking for things. They start providing them. Developmental psychologists have studied this pattern for decades. The term you'll find most often in the research is role reversal, a situation in which the emotional or practical dynamic between a parent and child becomes inverted. The child begins functioning, psychologically speaking, as the more stable presence in the relationship. This is different from simply being helpful. Every child helps around the house. This is something more specific. It's when a child begins monitoring a parent's emotional state as a matter of habit. When they learn to suppress their own feelings to keep the environment calm. When their internal reference point for safety stops being, "Am I okay?" and becomes, "Are they okay?" That shift is subtle, but its consequences stretch across a lifetime. Here's where the science becomes genuinely striking. The human brain is not finished at birth. Not even close. In fact, the regions responsible for emotional processing, self-regulation, and relational decision-making continue developing well into a person's mid-20s. Childhood is supposed to be the period where those systems are built gradually, through play, through safe exploration, through the experience of having needs, and having those needs consistently met. When a child is pulled into adult emotional responsibilities too early, that developmental timeline gets disrupted. The brain, remarkably adaptive as it is, starts prioritizing the skills the environment is demanding. Researchers have found that children in these situations often develop an unusually heightened sensitivity to social and emotional cues. They become exceptionally good at reading tone of voice, facial expressions, shifts in energy. In the scientific literature, this is described as a form of chronic hypervigilance, a nervous system that has been trained to stay on alert, always scanning for what the people around them need. It's an impressive skill, and it costs something significant to develop it. Because while that scanning system is being reinforced, something else is being quietly set aside. The internal signals. The child's own hunger, tiredness, sadness, desire, boredom. All of those get moved to the background. Repeatedly. Over years. And what gets practiced gets wired. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years. That child is now in an office, a relationship, a friendship group. And everyone around them thinks they are the most grounded person in the room. They're the one who stays calm in a crisis. The one who remembers everyone else's needs while forgetting to eat lunch. The one who deflects every question about how they're doing with a redirect. I'm fine, but what about you? They've built a life that looks remarkably functional from every external angle. But spend time with them. Really spend time with them. And you'll start to notice the edges. A discomfort when someone does something kind for them without being asked. A near-reflexive guilt when they rest. A strange blankness that appears when someone asks them what they actually want. Not what they think is best for the situation, not what would help everyone else, but what they want. Because that question, for many of these individuals, is genuinely difficult to answer. They were never really given the space to practice wanting things for themselves. Nowhere does this pattern become more visible than in close relationships. Adults who matured too early often form connections that mirror the dynamics they grew up in, not out of weakness, but out of familiarity. The role of the emotionally available, endlessly patient, quietly self-sacrificing person feels natural to them. It's the role they rehearsed for years. They attract people who need a lot, and they give a lot, often without limit. But receiving is a different story. When a partner offers genuine care, unsolicited and unconditional, something in them resists it. Not loudly, just quietly. A slight pulling back. A suspicion that it won't last. A feeling impossible to fully justify rationally. That depending on someone is somehow dangerous. Attachment researchers describe this as a learned strategy. A way the nervous system protects itself based on early experience. When needs went unmet or were treated as inconvenient during childhood, the mind concluded it was safer not to have them, or at least not to show them. So they built walls that look like self-sufficiency. Walls that are very, very hard to take down, even when the person on the other side of them would very much like to help. There's one more dimension to this that doesn't get discussed enough. Psychologists who study human development note that adolescence, in particular, is supposed to serve a specific function. It's a period of identity formation, of asking who am I, separate from my family, separate from what's expected of me. That exploration requires something essential: space. Space to be uncertain. Space to be selfish in small, healthy ways. Space to try on different versions of yourself and discard the ones that don't fit. For children who matured too soon, that space was occupied by responsibility, by other people's needs, by the job of keeping things together when no one else could. And so they arrive in adulthood with a remarkable skill set and a quiet, unsettling gap where a fully formed sense of self was supposed to develop. They know how to function. They know how to perform. They know how to show up for others. But ask them who they are when no one needs anything from them, in a quiet room, with no role to play and no one to take care of. And something uncertain flickers across their face. Because in some deep, wordless way, they're still figuring that out. Here's what makes this particularly complex. The adaptations these individuals develop don't look like damage. They look like virtue. Responsibility is celebrated. Emotional intelligence is admired. Self-sufficiency is respected. In school systems, in workplaces, in social circles, the behaviors that came from childhood survival are consistently rewarded in adult life. So, there's very little external pressure to examine them. Why would you question something that everyone around you keeps calling strength? The answer, and this is what psychology keeps returning to, is that a behavior can be both genuinely useful and a response to something that shouldn't have happened. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The child who learned to be self-sufficient because depending on others felt unsafe has real skills. And they also carry a real wound. Both are true at the same time. Recognizing one doesn't erase the other. It's worth being clear about something here. Healing, for people who matured too soon, doesn't mean dismantling everything they built. It doesn't mean becoming less responsible, or less empathetic, or less attuned to the people they love. It means something quieter, and, in many ways, more difficult than that. It means learning to include themselves in the circle of people they care for. It means noticing the reflexive urge to say, "I'm fine," and pausing long enough to ask whether that's actually true. It means sitting with the discomfort of receiving care without immediately finding a way to return it or deflect it or minimize it. It means allowing themselves, perhaps for the first time in their lives, to have needs that are visible, to ask for things without immediately apologizing for the asking, to rest without manufacturing a justification for the rest. None of this happens quickly, and none of it is linear. People who spent years unlearning their own needs don't rediscover them in a weekend. Therapists who work in this area often describe it as a slow, patient process of building internal permission. Permission to matter. Permission to want. Permission to simply be, without output, without function, without usefulness. And underneath all of that work, there is something worth recovering. Because the child who learned to grow up too fast still exists inside the adult. And somewhere in them is a version of childhood they never fully got to live. Not a regression, not an excuse to abandon responsibility, just a quieter, more honest relationship with their own inner life. That's not weakness. That's a kind of courage most people never have to practice. If you made it to the end of this video, I want to say something directly. If this described you, if you recognize yourself in the capable, exhausted, quietly lonely adult at the beginning, that recognition matters. Not as a diagnosis, not as a label, but as a starting point. Understanding where a pattern comes from is the first step toward deciding whether you still want to carry it. You spent a long time taking care of everything around you. Maybe it's time to include yourself in that. If this video reached something in you, share it with someone you think it might help. And if you want to go deeper into the psychology of how early childhood shapes adult behavior, the next video is right there. I think you'll find it worth your time. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.